If you had any questions as to how strategically important the AI industry and the chip industry were to the US government, they are said to be considering taking a stake in Intel. Welcome back to the AI Daily Brief Headlines Edition, all the daily AI news you need in around 5 minutes. Well, here's an interesting one. The Trump administration is in talks to have the US government take a stake in Intel. Bloomberg sources said the deal is intended to shore up Intel's planned factory hub in Ohio. Intel had previously pledged to turn the site into the world's largest chip-making facility and were provisioned with government subsidies out of the Biden administration's CHIPS Act to make it happen. However, slowing sales over recent years has meant the facility made less and less sense and no meaningful progress has been made. Earlier this year, reports stated that the administration was trying to put together a TSMC-led joint venture to take over parts of Intel's operations. In fact, those reports have been popping up all year, but they've always been very murky as to exactly what the state of the negotiations were. Still, it seemed pretty clear that TSMC was being dragged to the table and wasn't particularly keen to take on Intel's problems. But then last week, all of this got even louder when Trump called on Intel's CEO Lip-Bu Tan to resign. He posted, "The CEO of Intel is highly conflicted, all caps, obviously, and must resign immediately. There is no other solution to this problem." Now, there were no further details, but the outburst was likely related to allegations leveled by Senator Tom Cotton earlier in the week. Cotton wrote a letter to the Intel board asking about Tan's previous CEO role at a chip design firm that contracted with the Chinese government. In July, that firm agreed to a plea deal with the US government to settle claims that it illegally exported products to China between 2015 and 2021 when Tan was CEO. By the end of last week, it emerged that Tan had been locked in a power struggle with Intel's board. The Wall Street Journal reported that some board members were pushing for Intel to stop manufacturing their own chips. It seemed that Tan was at odds with Chairman Frank Yeary on the issue almost immediately after he was appointed CEO back in March. Yeary, a former investment banker, had already drawn up plans to sell off Intel's manufacturing business. Tan, meanwhile, wanted to conduct a multi-billion-dollar capital raise to fund a restructuring of the business, kicking off in July. Yeary and other board members reportedly blocked the fundraising as they wanted to move more slowly. All of this is to say that the intrigue has been building for months, but there has been very little clarity on how things were going to work out for Intel. Now it appears that the Trump administration views Intel's manufacturing capabilities as a national security issue. And yet, neither the Intel board nor outside investors seem willing to put up the capital to turn around the loss-making division. The solution of a TSMC joint venture was always messy at best, with the White House insisting they could only take a 49% share to ensure it wasn't majority foreign-owned, and it was with all of that context that new reports came out suggesting the administration has discussed the prospect of taking a stake in Intel, specifically doing so in a meeting with Tan on Monday. At this stage, we basically have no details on how a deal would be structured, and the reporting stated that the talks are still in early stages. The WSJ painted the news as the latest in a string of unconventional private sector interventions from Trump, obviously referring, among other things, to the unprecedented 15% export charges on Nvidia and AMD products bound for China. Now, if the Wall Street Journal was sort of indicating the irregularity of this engagement, the New York Times was much less subtle in their critique, blaring the headline that Trump has made himself commander-in-chief of the chip industry. Meanwhile, if you go on Twitter/X, you will variously find accusations of this being an example of fascism or, on the other hand, socialism, just to give you a sense of how it's all going. Luke Groman had a more measured take, trying to suss out why people are reacting differently to this than to some previous government interventions. He writes, October 2008, the US government invests $250 billion into failing US banks and Wall Street cheers. August 2025, the US government invests into US defense industrial base that is losing to China and that just got outproduced 4-1 in Ukraine by Russia, and Wall Street boos. Why the difference in reaction? Now, I have to say before we move on that the other hilarious to me sub-story is that you'll remember that we talked about earlier in the week situational awareness. The hedge fund from 23-year-old former OpenAI staffer Leopold Aschenbrenner, who had raised $1.5 billion with no previous financial experience and was sitting on something like 47% gains for the year. Ever since that article came out, people have been absolutely harping on the dude for his Intel calls. That's right, for his Intel calls. Buco Capital this morning posted a video of Cameron freestyling with a pile of money in his hands and said, "This is Leopold Aschenbrenner today after being clowned on literally this weekend for being neck deep in Intel calls." Wild times, man. Wild times. Now, speaking of US-China chip geopolitics, the Financial Times reports that the delay of DeepSeek's new model has been caused by a failed training run on Huawei chips. The report suggests that Chinese authorities pushed DeepSeek to adopt Huawei's Ascend chips rather than use Nvidia training clusters for the follow-up to their viral R1 model. Sources said that the startup encountered persistent technical issues during the training process, leading them to ultimately use Nvidia chips for training and Huawei for inference. These issues, say the reports, were the main reason the model's launch was delayed back in May. Industry insiders in China said that the Chinese chips suffer from stability issues, slower inter-chip connectivity, and inferior software compared to Nvidia GPUs. Huawei reportedly had a team on site during DeepSeek's training runs, but they still couldn't conduct a successful run on the Ascend chips. Obviously, if accurate, this sheds new light on Chinese authorities' recent push to force domestic firms to use Huawei chips. If the chips aren't capable of completing advanced training runs, then obviously that's going to be a huge problem for the advancement of Chinese AI. It also implies that the Chinese government is pushing their companies to use inferior or non-functional chips in pursuit of nationalist or protectionist goals. Now, the Chinese bots on X are out in force calling this fake news, suggesting, if anything, to me that it's probably more accurate than not. This is now becoming an issue in financial reporting as well, with the president of Chinese tech giant Tencent saying that they have enough AI chips for training. During their earnings call yesterday, Martin Lau told analysts, "We don't really have a definitive answer on the import situation of the US chips. I think there's a lot of discussion between the two governments and we're waiting to see exactly what comes out of that. But from our perspective, we do have enough chips for training and continuous upgrade of our existing models, and we also have many options for inference chips, and we are also executing a lot of software improvement and upgrade in order to drive efficiency gains in inference so that we can actually put more workload on the same number of chips." If you've been paying close attention to this show all week, you'll know that there's been a back and forth between the White House finally saying, yes, it's okay to export these H-20s, with a 15% take rate, of course, and then China saying, no, don't use those. So all of this is up in the air. The intrigue continues. But before we move to the main episode, let's bring it back to some fundraising news. One fairly big and kind of unexpected one comes from Coher. The company announced a $500 million raise at a $6.8 billion valuation. Now, on the one hand, this is a fairly modest jump, at least by crazy AI standards, from the $5.5 billion they achieved during their last round a little over a year ago. At the same time, the round was oversubscribed, and it seems like Coher were able to take their pick of big strategic names. In addition to the fresh funding, Coher added Joel Pinnow as Chief AI Officer. Pinnow left Meta in April, where she was the VP of AI Research and a day-to-day leader at their FAIR research lab. The company also added Francois Chadwick as CFO. Chadwick was involved in Uber for 10 years, including serving as acting CFO in 2017. Now, what makes all this notable is that this indicates that Coher's second act really has some legs. The Canadian startup was originally founded in 2019 and was initially involved in the foundation model and chatbot competition. However, over the course of the last year or so, the company pivoted hard towards deployment of on-premise AI for enterprises. The headline of their blog post reinforced that this is the approach, saying Coher raises $500 million at $6.8 billion valuation to accelerate enterprise efficiency with agentic AI. The new capital, they write, will enable us to accelerate our efforts to make businesses and governments around the world vastly more efficient, simplifying tedious tasks through agentic AI solutions. We aim to free up people to spend their time on the interesting, challenging, and human parts of work, all while prioritizing data security. This represents a security-first category of enterprise AI that is simply not being met by repurposed consumer models. I actually think that Coher have found a really important and valuable niche here. The foundation model companies do not have the time, bandwidth, or appetite, frankly, to go in and do the sort of customization work and implementation work that enterprises require in many circumstances. At the same time, the GSIs who are doing that work don't have anywhere near the type of talent and actual technical capacity to go do that in any meaningful way as well. Enter Coher, and there's probably room for a couple other players in that space as well. But congrats to them. It is no mean feat to transition a company at that stage this successfully. Lastly today, it appears that Cognition AI is also raising a big new round. The Wall Street Journal reports that the startup has raised $500 million at a $9.8 billion valuation. Reportedly, Founders Fund is leading the round, which more than doubles the company's valuation from back in March. Now, Cognition most recently made a splash by acquiring the remains of Windsurf after Google acqui-hired their founder. And between that IP and this new round of money, Cognition is now armed with a ton of fresh capital to make a serious run to disrupting the still nascent AI coding space. Now, speaking of the nascent AI coding space, that is the subject of our main episode. So let's turn to that now.